Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I'm back this week with a complete playthrough with commentary of an impressive game, and this time around, I'll be taking a look at the Famicom version of Gradius II. You may have seen my recent arcade vs PC Engine video on Gradius II. If not, it'll be linked above, below, and probably someplace else. If you want more info on the game itself, check out that video, but I will tell you a smidge about the Famicom port since we're looking at that one today. Gradius II for the Famicom came out in 1988 and was sort of the third game in the series to hit the system. It followed up on the original Gradius and Life Force/Salamander. Things had improved a bit tech-wise thanks to some new mappers that have become available for Famicom games, so Gradius II on Famicom is a bit fancier looking and sounding than the two games that preceded it. Personally, I think I still prefer Life Force to this one overall, but it's still a very good and impressive game for the system. This time around, you can even get a full complement of 4 options. Sadly, this game remained a Japan exclusive, never having made its way to any other major territory in an official capacity. If you've missed this version of Gradius 2, well, stick around for the whole video, there's some cool stuff here, and I'm going to save talking about it for the commentary. As for my recording methodology for this one, I think I used one save state throughout the whole thing, which was mainly because I didn't have a ton of time and wanted to show you the whole game uninterrupted to make it through to the end as quickly as possible. Alright, let's get on with it. Alright, so this is Famicom Gradius II. As we get going, you can see we've got the power meter select just like the arcade original, even though some of the things are a bit different. And as we get going, you can also see it looks very Famicom/NES-like, which is hardly a surprise. But look at this, there's already a little hint of flicker. Just imagine what this is going to look like once we have our full complement of power-ups. Still, it looks pretty nice for an NES game overall. And you can see right here, this is already going to be a slightly different experience than the arcade game. These enemies are not here in the beginning of the arcade game. Oh, and if you're wondering about the Konami code, it is in this game, but it gives you 30 lives instead of powering your ship up. You have to do it on the title screen. So here we are with 2 options, which in the original Gradius and the US release of Life Force was your max number. For the Famicom version of Life Force/Salamander in Japan, you can have 3 options. In this game, you can have all 4. So thus far, this is sticking fairly close to the arcade game. There are a few differences here and there, but definitely recognizable. You can tell the music is the same as the arcade game. That is going to change as we progress through the levels here. Look at all that flicker right there. Ugh. Now, you might think we're heading into the end of the level, because that's pretty much where this level ends in the arcade original, but no, in this one we have a whole different section that is pretty reminiscent in some ways of Life Force and Salamander's third level, with these flame eruptions. And fans of that game will also recognize the enemies that we're seeing here and dealing with. There's a new option, power up if you didn't see it. Once you have a full complement of options, you can select option again, which will have them rotate around you. Not particularly useful for most of the game, but I did it here just so you could get a look at it. That is the only time you will see it in this game, because I don't find it useful for anything else. Really just to show off. We're getting close to the end of the level here. You can tell the flicker has gotten pretty rough at this point. Even with almost nothing else on screen, there's still a lot of flicker with the weapons. You can see we lose the star field as we head into the boss because, well, the boss is a background, as was so often the case in 8-bit titles. And there's level 1 in the books. Now things are going to be a little different with level 2. still not a drastic departure from the arcade game. You probably still think this looks pretty familiar if you're a fan of that one. But stick with this, it's going to change a lot, and pretty soon. And as we get into this level, you can hear the music is totally different from the arcade game. It's a new song. Oh, I probably should have mentioned the boss music in this game is primarily like the boss from the final stages of the arcade version of Gradius II, rather than the normal stage boss music from that game. We will only hear the quote-unquote normal stage boss music one time in this one. It's almost reversed from the arcade game. Unlike the PC Engine version, we don't have any kind of parallax here or animated tiles to simulate it or anything. And you can see that the enemies in here are quite a bit different. And overall, while we have sort of the basic feel of the arcade version of this level, it is really, really structured differently. And we have our arms that we should be familiar with from the arcade version and also from Life Force / Salamander. And again, there is an inordinate amount of flicker here. Some of the worst I've seen on NES. And even so, I can deal with it here. I mean, this game was incredibly ambitious. And usually you can still get enough of what's going on to avoid getting killed. So it's not ideal, but it's still impressive for the system. And this is just what happens when you're up against hard limitations. Now we're getting ready to approach the boss area now. So this part is mostly similar to the arcade original. And when we get up to the boss, it's going to be pretty similar to the arcade original, to a point. Then things are going to get radically different. Now we'll explain when we get there. And here we are, coming up to it. So again, fans of the arcade version will find this very familiar. It's interesting, the very low frame rate that the arms move at. But when you take out that boss in this one, that's not the end of the level. There is a whole nother boss here. Whole nother. That's not really a thing. There's another boss right after that one, I should have said. And this is reminiscent of a boss from Life Force / Salamander on the NES / Famicom. Except this time we have a side view of it instead of an overhead view of it. And that is the end of Level 2. Level 3, well, things are going to get pretty interesting here. Level 3 in this game is not quite like Level 3 in the arcade game, and you will see what I mean. So as we get into Level 3 here, I will explain right now. Level 3 in the Famicom version here of Gradius II is a combination of Levels 3 and 4 from the arcade version of Gradius II. Why did they combine these two levels into one? I have no idea. And frankly, it kinda hurts the pacing of the game a bit. It makes it feel like the level just goes on for too long. And there's no boss when you get to the end of this section. It's just going to change from this area to the crystal area of the arcade game. And once again, I hate to keep pointing out, but just so much flicker. Even with a weapon like Double that doesn't create nearly as many, sprites on screen at one time as the laser. Anyway, we've got the volcanoes like the arcade game. There's actually more of them in this version. the layout's a little different. The music is completely different. It doesn't match either the arcade version or the stage number from that one. And then instead of having a boss here and getting ready to proceed to the next level, we just are suddenly in space with crystals from there. And for this area, it is Flicker and Slow Down City. Again, I can appreciate the ambition, and this game is still really good, but like a lot of late games for systems, I feel like it was maybe a little over-ambitious, and they should have maybe sort of tamped down that ambition a little bit to fit better in line with the hardware's capabilities. Because, I mean, it's kind of hard to look at this. I mean, it really is. There's so much flicker and so much slowdown. And once again, we have another song that doesn't appear anywhere in the arcade game. The arcade game's music relied heavily on samples, and I think that's part of the reason that they decided to change so many of the songs in this one. There are some points where the flicker actually is kind of an issue because it makes enemy bullets disappear. Like if you're looking at them and you keep your eye on a bullet, you'll see there are points when they flash out of view and become invisible. I mean, if there are two things that should have had priority all the time, it should be your ship and enemy bullets, so you can at least continue to avoid them if there's a lot of other flicker going on. And while this doesn't port the arcade level's layout exactly, I mean, they definitely got the feel of it. So if all you had was a Famicom back then and you got this version to play at home, despite these issues with the intense flicker, you probably still would have been pretty happy with this game. As you can see, this part is quite reminiscent of the arcade original. And what I'll do at the end of the video here is I'll show you a few just really short comparisons while I give you the summary of everything we've seen here today. So I'll show you this, some part of this level versus the arcade original, side by side. Now we're getting ready to head into the boss. Again, the enemy layout's slightly different. In the arcade, we have enemies that make big swooping arcs on this part. And here is our boss, who looks pretty familiar. The shots are way slower. So this version of the boss is a lot easier, I think, than the arcade or even PC Engine ports of the game. But it looks great. I mean, they've done a pretty good job, aside from all the flicker, of course. And believe it or not, that is level 3, and only level 3. So here we head into the 4th level of Famicom Gradius II. This one is a little more returned to form and a little more similar to the arcade release, but it's still not an exact port of the level. And this was really common, I've got to say, in NES/Famicom games, if you weren't aware. When they ported an arcade game, especially like 16-bit titles from the arcade to the Famicom, they very often changed level orders, level layouts, enemy positions or the types of enemies that show up. So not at all unusual. And this time around, they did keep the song from the arcade release. This might be the last level that keeps the song, I don't remember. But yeah, most of the music in this one does not match the levels from the arcade release. which that is something that I'm never a fan of. I can only assume, like I said earlier, that they did that because so much of the arcade game's music was dependent on the samples that it used, which you couldn't really do on the NES. Now the samples that are in here, which are primarily drums and voices in this version, are pretty well done and they're nice and clear, as was very much often the case with NES ports from Konami. We remember super clear voices and stuff like Track and Field 2 also, right? And we are heading further and further into Moai territory here. They do have quite a decent amount of sprites on screen, I've got to say. And what's interesting here is they aren't flickering the enemy projectiles like they did in the PC Engine port. Now, having said that, there's not as many on screen here, but it might have been an interesting way to tackle the problem. You might have been able to get more on screen with less flicker if they had done that. Alright, here we are heading into the back portion of the stage, which is just a tiny little sliver of the level and then the boss. Now in the other versions, there's multiples of these things. Here we've got one. Normally there's 4. So you get just sort of a taste. And then we go through just a tiny little section, and then we'll get up to the giant Moai head bosses. And just visually, I mean, they did a really nice job on this one. Again, considering the limitations, this looks very close to the arcade original, especially on the NES hardware. Now, you can make the argument that this perhaps goes on a little bit too long, and I'd say you're right about that. But it's not too terrible. We'll be through it soon here. The one thing that they didn't carry over from Life Force that I wish they had was being able to power up the missiles twice to make them faster. Alright, now we're getting ready for our boss rush here. And yeah, this section, pretty much exactly the same as the arcade original. Not quite as many of those annoying enemies on screen at once due to sprite limitations, but there are enough to make it aggravating. Alright, here's the reappearance of the boss from Gradius. This time, when you blow open the gates in front of the eye, they burst into a spread of bullets. There's our first boss down. And of course, that was some original Gradius boss music. Now we have Life Force boss music to accompany a Life Force boss. And man, the flicker is out in full force here. So unlike in the original Life Force, the eye pops open and goes away every so often in this one. There he is taken care of. Next up we have Intruder. Now in Life Force, they made the arms just a bunch of circular little bubbles, so they didn't have to have all the rotation frames. In this version, they've gone all out and given them the rotating arm segments. Looks great. A lot of slowdown, but it looks great. And yeah, this boss is just as annoying here as it is in the other versions. You can sort of quick kill it better in this one, but I didn't want to risk getting killed, so I played it safe. And we've almost got him here. And there we go, Intruder is down. Now here is where things get quite radically different. In the arcade original, we saw a different boss from Salamander/Life Force here. This is Zelos, the last boss from Life Force. And his attacks are a little bit different here. In Life Force, he was mainly just stationary and you just blasted it until it died. In some versions, it shot lightning out at you, so they incorporated that from some of the other versions into this one. So now if blowing up one giant circle wasn't enough for you, here's another one. So this is the stage boss, and it is the same one that we see in the arcade version to end this level. And I'd say this boss is actually tougher in this version than the arcade original or even PC Engine one. Why? Because there's less slowdown here than there is in either of those. Very odd since there's so much slowdown in this port. Alright, and now we are heading into what would be in the arcade version the final level of the game. Except in this one, we've got another one of these levels on Famicom that combines sections from two levels of the arcade game. We start out with a bit of the arcade game's final level, move on to a section from the arcade speed level, and then finish off with another bit from the arcade's final level. And I will note this is not the final level of Famicom Gradius, it's the second to last level. There will be another level, a short one, after this one. What is the final level in Famicom Gradius II, you may wonder? Well, they sort of took the very last little segment from the arcade game and expanded it out into a full level. But you will see what I mean shortly. Another thing I'll point out just about this game in general is overall, this is much easier than the arcade or PC Engine versions of Gradius II. So if you wanted to get the basic Gradius II experience without having to spend a lot of time getting good at the game, this is not a bad way to start. So here we go with the speed level. Again, we don't have any kind of parallax here like we would see in the arcade or even PC Engine versions of the game. But they've managed to replicate it pretty well. If you're wondering why I took double there, I did it totally on purpose, of course. It wasn't at all an accident. Of course, one of the key things here is to make sure you have enough speed power-ups, because if you don't, you won't have time to react and you will smash into these walls. You really need about at least 3 of them in order to navigate this easily. And then after that, we're sort of back into a section of the arcade game's final level. And then there's going to be one huge distinction between the boss we're about to face in this one and the arcade game. So number 1, over here there's no hiding place, but number 2, you don't really need it because it doesn't shoot at you nearly as much. Now in the arcade game I would say this section is wildly unfair unless you know about the hiding spot. Here they made it so that it's easier to actually just defeat the thing normally without having to use much strategy. So now we're going to see another big distinction between this version versus the arcade one. So we have the big spider coming up right after this section with all the moving walls and stuff. Oddly enough, these moving walls look a little bit nicer here than they do in the PC Engine version, where they... I don't know, there's just something about it. It looks a little rougher, like they're lower frame rate as they move. But we've got the spider boss coming up now, and the arcade one, you just had to avoid it and go through its legs as it was walking. You know, very carefully maneuvering your ship underneath the leg while it was lifted up, so that it didn't smash into you and kill you. In this version, you've got to do that just for one part of the boss, and then things get a little different, which you'll see here. And they did a nice job on this, you know, considering Famicom limitations. I think this thing looks really good. And here's where it gets different. You can destroy it. Look at that. If only you could do that in the other versions. Alright, so now we've got our final level, which is an extended version of the final segment from the arcade game. Sort of has all this brain material as its background. In the arcade game, you just flew through this for about 3 seconds. There was a part that closed up behind you when you fought the boss. We're going to see the parts that sort of close up behind us, but they've made it a little more substantial here. And they've thrown in bits that make it seem quite a bit more related to Life Force than arcade Gradius II. Which that's all fine, and it's still not a long level. We're probably about halfway through already. I do think there's part of the level here that is kind of wildly unfair, especially the first time you do this, where that stuff just materializes super fast right in front of you, and if you don't know it's there, you don't have any time to react. So you've got to memorize and know that it's there and where it's going to show up. As you can see, I kind of got ahead of myself and almost took a death there. And then we have not one thing that closes behind you, but two. And of course, if you're on the other side of that thing when it closes, you are screwed. And here is our final boss. And while the speech is really clear in this game, it is also quite low. It can be very hard to hear it. And then the boss itself, while it looks just like the arcade version, is quite different. In the arcade original, you have to blow up all the little veins or whatever that are connecting it to the section of the level there. In this version, you just gotta shoot him in the face, while he shoots bullets at you constantly out of his mouth. You didn't really see him there because I shot most of them out because you could do that. Alright, time for the credits roll. Now while this is going on, I'll say that Famicom Gradius II is a really interesting game. Obviously, in a lot of ways, this game pushes the Famicom harder than nearly any other shooter or shmup on the entire system. And that's why we see so much on screen, and so much flicker, and so much slowdown. This game was just wildly ambitious, and in some ways, maybe a little too ambitious for the hardware. I feel like it probably would have benefited a little bit if they had scaled some things down. You know, especially that crystal level, and, I mean, really, they probably should have limited the options to either 2 or 3 like the other games, even though it's nice to have all 4. Still, I can't help but appreciate that Konami really swung for the fences with this one. Now, I'm not thrilled that they changed so much of the music in the game and that they combined levels and eliminated some bosses, but, you know, in the end, we get a different experience. So if we want to play an accurate version of Gradius 2, well, there's always the arcade release. And then, right after that, you know, there's the PC Engine release, there's the X68000 release, and now if you want something a little different, you can play the Famicom version. So if nothing else, it's nice to have one version that brings something a little bit different to the table. And there we are, the complete game of Famicom Gradius II. It's kind of odd in a few ways, particularly in how there are 2 stages in this one that actually contain 4 stages from the arcade version. I feel like the game would have felt a little better if we had those extra stage breaks, as the combined stages feel a bit too long. And yeah, there's a ton of flicker and some slowdown here and there. But considering the hardware they had to work with, Konami did a fantastic job, as they so often did. It's fun to come back to this version every now and then, since it offers something a bit different from the arcade and PC Engine releases. It's not better than those versions, but it's still an interesting compromise for the hardware it's on, and some of the changes made give this one a smidge of its own flavor versus the other games. So absolutely worth playing, I would say. What about all of you? Have you played Famicom Gradius II? What's your favorite version of the game? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you'll know when my next video is released. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can now do that as a channel member or on Patreon or Ko-fi, with links that follow below and in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.